Tanks and guns, the Soviet answer to Japan.
By the thousands, new Japanese reinforcements pour into the Tachang salient to cut off the Chinese in Shapei and Chenju.
I don't think there is a sane person in this world who doesn't consider war as a horrible event. However, although the horrific scenes of war are bad enough in themselves, what happens behind closed doors is very often significantly worse. We have the evidence in the form of Josef Mengele, who marked Germany for the whole of history. And while his criminal and disturbing endeavors are public knowledge by this point, some others who have done almost the same things remain forgotten. Well, the logical question would be why? And the answer is quite simple. All those who committed some of the worst atrocities imaginable simply decided to sweep all that up under the rug and act like nothing ever happened. Numerous horrors committed simply just vanished. The horrors committed by an infamous group you've probably never heard of. Unit 731.
At the height of the Second World War, Germany's Nazi Party marched toward global domination, led by its ambitious, remorseless leader.
The Nazi Germany was definitely not alone in the crimes against humanity. They only received the worst punishment of all the participants. Politics and political interests always play a big role in whatever global event is at stake, so Second World War was no exception. The first associations when World War II and Japan are mentioned are probably Pearl Harbor, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. However, there is no trace or voice from the mentioning of Unit 731, which was almost in the same rank as the SS. So, let's change that today. The unit was established in 1935 as a department for epidemic prevention and water purification. The unit was originally owned by the Japanese military police, but was taken over by General Shiro Ishii in a very short period of time. So the unit functioned under the official status of an epidemic department, while in reality it was total opposite. Shiro Ishii was given the task of developing biological and chemical weapons in secret, and at the same time the green light to conduct experiments on humans. One of Ishii's main supporters inside the army was Colonel Chikahiko Koizumi, who later served as Japan's health minister from 1941 to 1945. Koizumi had joined the secret poison gas research committee in 1915 during World War I. The facilities were located in the Manchuria area, which was in China, and whose residents, along with prisoners of war, mainly Russian, were mostly guinea pigs. It is estimated that at the peak of this unit's work in 1931, as many as 10,000 people were employed. After the end of the war, the whole complex of buildings was shut down, and I will tell you what happened after that. But what I'll tell you now is what actually happened during the war, and believe me when I say, it is nothing pretty. special project codenamed Maruta used human beings for experiments. Test subjects were gathered from the surrounding population and sometimes referred to as logs, used in such context as how many logs fell. This term originated as a joke because the official cover story for the facility given to local authorities was that it was a lumber mill. Since the unit developed these types of weapons, the same had to be tested, and people, unfortunately, found themselves there as subjects. However, in addition to that, many other tests were performed in an attempt to understand what the human body is capable of. In this way, the Japanese military could better understand how many their own troops could handle. One of the many things the soldiers had to endure was the cold that killed many people on its own, and Unit 731 wanted to know what the tolerance threshold was when it came to the low temperatures. Enter sick scumbag by the name of Hisato Yoshimura, who also went by Scientific Devil and Cold-Blooded Animal, and he was in charge in conducting horrifying experiments which included below zero temperatures. Some subjects were taken outside during the brutal winter to freeze their limbs completely, so the doctors could then experiment what is the best way to treat frostbites. The guards often knew to speed up the process by pouring water on them until their body parts froze. Often a guard would strike a part of the body with a stick to check that the same part was frozen, and then the doctors would use various methods to try to defrost it. Sometimes they would let it defrost on its own, sometimes they used warm or hot water. The pain was so intense and they suffered in such agony they were digging their nails into each other's flesh. The military also wanted to know the best way to treat infectious diseases and injuries, and reportedly used live subjects to get the best results. Some prisoners were deliberately infected and then cut open without any anesthesia. They wanted to discover the effects of the infection before the body began to break down, so they performed vivisections. One of the main experiments was the reaction of patients to exposure to anthrax and cholera pathogens, and they actually didn't do this just inside the camp. They also did something they called field testing. This was done by literally pollinating smaller communities in China with particles of these pathogens, wanting to see if they could cause a pandemic outbreak. Some reports say that this was proved successful, so the Japanese have started making so-called pathogenic bombs and dropping them around the US. But this has not been successful as only 7 people actually died. They also planned to use the entire fleets of infected planes to attack San Diego with kamikazes, but the war ended before they could carry out the venture. Ishii didn't terrorize the surrounding villages only from the air, but he also sent a special unit called Kenpentai, also known as the Japanese Gestapo. Whether you were a man, a woman, or a child, it didn't matter at all. Ishii looked upon everybody the same, and only as a number he needed for his testing. The military wanted to test weapons they could use on a battlefield, and this included standard weapons and new models of bombs. Prisoners would be taken to the field, tied to a wooden pole, and the army would test weapons by firing at them and throwing grenades from various positions to see their effectiveness. The bodies were then analyzed by doctors so they could know exactly the damage their weapons could produce. There are some reports that soldiers have sometimes tested even flamethrowers. Absolutely sickening. Perhaps one of the worst experiments was the pressure chamber. Subjects would be placed in a chamber, sometimes together, and the pressure would be increased to the point where their eyes literally fell out. In order to improve the experience of surgeons at a time, patients often suffered from the removal of bullets from the abdomen, but they were deliberately placed there. Amputation and reattaching of the limbs, forced intercourse to catch syphilis, radiation exposure, and much more. And all this lasted for a total of 10 years. When the war was finally over and when Japan surrendered to the Allies, Ishii ordered that all files and evidence be burned, as well as that the entire complex be completely destroyed, so that all evidence and the atrocities they committed could simply disappear. Now we come to the part about what happened next. Unlike the German war criminals, or at least those who failed to escape and who were tried in you know which city, a large number of members of Unit 731 remained almost intact. Now, a normal person would wonder how this was even possible. Well, most of you are probably familiar with the operation called Paperclip, an operation in which America raced with Russia over German scientists because of the Cold War which followed. An almost exact same thing happened here as well, with US government along with the British directly participating in covering up the whole thing in exchange for research conducted by Ishii and his team. After everything they did, they simply got immunity. At that point, even those captured by the Soviet Union didn't fare any worse, because only a few members were actually sentenced to 25 years in the Siberian Gulag. And this is, ladies and gentlemen, the direct and the only reason why so many people never knew or heard of these monstrosities at a time. It wasn't until 1980s that details about everything slowly began to emerge, but by then it was too late. Shiro Ishii died in 1960 of cancer at the age of 67. Even to this day, Japan continues to deny what happened, explaining that many events have been exaggerated or even fabricated. I guess the main thing we all need to realize is that we as individuals learn history and think we know, but in reality, we learn history that is heavily distorted, and only later we find out there is also another side, a much darker side that is often hidden, as was the case with the Unit 731.